The next panel really gives me great pleasure to welcome and introduce a dear friend and a colleague of mine at the Price School, my environmental guru, as I call him. Antonio has been an amazing faculty member at the Price School, as well as a wonderful researcher and someone who has contributed substantially to not only scholarship, but also to the practice. And that is what I value the most. And the next panel is on energy financing. And Antonio is an economist by training. And it's a great pleasure to have him here. And Antonio, the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I will be talking primarily about trends in the energy sector in California and highlight some of the state as well as federal policies that have been put in place over the years to facilitate the energy transition. Now, as Frank said, I'm an economist by training, although I want to make a point very clear. Most of my work in the economics of climate change has been primarily focused on the transportation sector. And just to give you a sense, some of the work that I've done over the years have informed various administrations, for example, for the setting of fuel economy standards, as well as for policies to transition towards cleaner vehicles. Of course, my growing interest in the energy sector and the grid has actually to do with the general question that part of our ambition to decarbonize the economy ultimately rests in our success to clean the grid. And by that, I mean to transition the grid away from fossil fuels. And so if most of the decarbonization of the economy consider, for example, the transportation sector is going to rely on electrification, we clearly need to look at the energy sector with a lot of detail. And so I want to start by saying that when we look at California, of course, California has been leading the way when it comes to progress towards clean energy. Having said that, we have been somewhat on target to meet our climate goals. And despite this progress towards clean electricity, to a certain extent, we are still a little bit far behind because perhaps we are not moving also in the transportation sector as fast as we can. And even though we have adopted clean vehicles, because the amount of driving mostly outweighs the gains from reductions in emissions from transportation, overall emissions from transportation have continued to go up. And so the need to look at the electricity sector is more important than ever. Now, in looking at the electricity sector and energy transition more broadly, I am going to highlight some of the trends that we are seeing across the state, how much of those trends are driven by public policy. And then, of course, I'm going to give you an outlook of where I think we ought to go in the coming years. Now, at the end of the day, as we talk about clean electricity, of course, the biggest bottleneck is how fast can technology move us to a point where we could actually store the clean and renewable energy that we are producing, so that we can so that we have the ability to perhaps rely less on highly volatile sources such as natural gas, for which we have seen, for example, since the invasion of Russia to the Ukraine, we have seen a massive spike in natural gas prices. And of course, what this ends up doing is also putting additional pressure on the wholesale price of electricity. So I'm going to return to that topic as well. But if we start by looking at California, we can see that California in general is on target to meet the goal of arriving at roughly 2045 with 100% of clean electricity. And here you can see the evolution from 2013 to 2020. And as you will see in a second, most of the increase in clean energy has really come from an expansion of renewables. Hydro has increased initially from 2013 to 2020, but has roughly remained constant. And to a certain extent, the appetite for nuclear energy, which we should also discuss, has been somewhat modest and has remained stable throughout this time. Now, for us to understand why California is a very important case study here, is that, of course, to move at the pace of energy transition to meet climate goals, this is only possible in part thanks to a variety of economic incentives and public policies that have been put in place to facilitate this fast transition. And so California has been leading the country and to a certain extent the world in designing a variety of public policies that promote this transition. I'm going to highlight primarily two key policies, and then I will give you a flavor of complementary policies that have further help us in this direction. And so the major policy is really the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And what the Renewable Portfolio Standard does is that it requires electricity providers to assure that a portion of the electric load comes from renewable energy. Now, this policy has been complemented by an additional mandate that has actually promoted the expansion of rooftop solar through a solar mandate. Now, I want to give you a little bit of an evolution of the Renewable Portfolio Standard and the various Senate bills that have been put in place, so you appreciate to a certain extent that how important this regulation has been. And I would say that this regulation has been important from the perspective of creating the market, which in turn has the added benefit that as the markets scale up, presumably with discoveries and innovation, the costs of solar and wind in particular have rapidly declined. But truth being told, absent of these policies, our scale up of renewables would have been much, much slower. And so with Senate Bill 1078 was really the bill that established the Renewable Portfolio Standard. And initially, given the state of the art of technology, the goal was simply to reach roughly 20% of renewables by 2017. That bill was quickly replaced by Bill 107 that pushed the goal from 2017 to 2010. And as we go down the list of bills here, we could see that the most relevant bill at the moment is really Senate Bill 100 that actually ultimately sets up the stage for the state to achieve carbon-free resources by 2045. Now, the California Solar Mandate is also a very interesting mandate. It started in the beginning of 2020, and it basically requires that all residential construction projects to have solar photovoltaic systems installed. And these are primarily for single-family homes, condominiums, and apartments less than 3 stories high. And in fact, as you are probably familiar with this mandate, then also comes a series of additional incentives to really encourage individuals to move towards rooftop solar. Now, of course, these are the 2 key policies that California has used to really fasten the transition towards renewables. But I think it's also important to put the discussion in the context of other relevant policies, and in particular also talk about the role of federal government, of course, recognizing that as different administrations come in and out of power, the appetite for some of these policies may be stronger or weaker. But historically, if we go back to 1978, you will see here with the different shades of gray here in rectangles, you see an earlier introduction of production and investment tax credits. These were tax credits to basically foster the investment in these technologies, with the idea that with learning by doing, their costs would decline over time. And then, of course, with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and more recently with the Inflation Reduction Act, additional provisions have been put in place by the federal government to scale up renewable energy, and those certainly strengthen what has already been accomplished in California with the Renewable Portfolio Standard and the California Solar Initiative. Now, from the perspective of the household that is installing rooftop solar, an important component of the incentive comes from the fact that if at any moment I have the rooftop solar and I'm actually producing more energy than the one that I'm using through the so-called net energy metering, I could actually send the excess of energy back to the grid in returns for credits on my next utility bill. As you may be familiar, this has been more recently a point of contention, to the extent that several reforms have perhaps made this incentive less profitable, even though perhaps with an economic justification that I will touch in a second. Now, as a result of policy, and I think this is quite important to note, indeed, in a 10-year period from here in the figure from 2008 to 2020, California renewable electricity generation has increased by a factor of 123%, starting in 2008 at 10.6%, all the way to over 33.1%. And so on the left side, you can map that into gigawatt hours per source, and you could actually see by looking at the areas in red and blue that most of this increase has been early on through solar, and actually more recent through wind. This figure also shows the role of biomass, which in my opinion can potentially be farther optimized, but as you can see, when we look at biomass, we roughly see a constant contribution through time, and to a certain extent, the same can be told about geothermal. Now, the final source, of course, that I want to mention is hydro, and in particular, small hydro. And here you see some fluctuations that in part actually reflect the vulnerability of hydro to climate change itself, and the idea that in years that we would have greater droughts, perhaps the contribution of hydro will go down. Now, another way to look at the contribution of renewables in California is to simply measure them against the percentage of California retail sales. And I think this gives us an important figure because it actually shows that despite the scale up, the quick scale up of renewables from the previous picture, you can still see that we have a long way to go, even if you look at 2020. So in 2020, again, you see in 2019, 2020, and more recently, you see renewables accounting for roughly 35 and more recently all the way to 40%, which basically suggests that with hydro and nuclear not together with renewables not making up the total demand, other sources of energy, and in particular natural gas, would probably be here to stay. Now, before I talk about the implications of all of these for prices, and I certainly have some concerns there, I want to highlight that it is very important to start thinking about strategies for scaling up storage as fast as possible, in part because in one hand, we want to move towards renewables partly because of climate change concerns, and to a certain extent, partly because of the benefits that this is going to bring in terms of local air pollution to our communities. But of course, as we move more towards renewables will introduce a greater volatility in supply of energy. I just mentioned droughts, but I mean, the most obvious case is when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. And from our perspective, what is important is that this volatility, unfortunately, will also translate in greater volatility in wholesale electricity prices. Now, absent of storage, natural gas is here to stay. And I think this is a little bit of the bottleneck that we face at the moment, because when we look in the recent years, the price of natural gas has, to a certain extent, spiked in many occasions. And of course, to the extent that natural gas is the marginal fuel that clears the wholesale price, what ends up happening is that the combination of the scaling up of renewables and the fact that natural gas, to a certain extent, is the complementary fuel to renewables, what we are, in a sense, trading off here is an increase in emissions reductions, which is very important to facilitate our climate goals, against higher electricity prices. So just to give you a sense, in some of the work that I have done commissioned by the European Union, one of the things that my research group has been asked to reflect is how does one handle this situation, in particular when you have very high gas price spikes. And as you may be familiar, the European Union actually established a price cap on natural gas and potentially actually caps on electricity prices to prevent the impact of that volatility in electricity prices and the spike on electricity prices on consumers. Now, why is this happening? I think this figure shows it very well. So this is a good day in California, where around 3 p.m. We could actually have situations where renewables actually produce the entire energy to meet the demand. But as you can see, the bulk of renewables between solar and wind is actually going to happen at hours that are disconnected with the times where we have higher demand. And the higher demand is actually happening essentially at the hours that we are at home. And what you can see if you look during the evening and past 6 p.m. is actually the need and the non-trivial need of natural gas. So despite, for example, nuclear, which one could certainly scale up, and countries like France have thought of nuclear as another option, you can see that even if we are importing from nearby regions to our state at these peak hours, our reliance on natural gas is still quite high. So, I am at this moment less concerned with the impact of this natural gas on greenhouse gas emissions. I'm actually more concerned with the impact of this reliance on natural gas on the resulting wholesale electricity prices. And so one of the things that we need to think about from a public policy perspective is what other ways can we put in place to alleviate this dependence on natural gas? And here we have three potential strategies: greater integration and coordination with the Western grid. And this would actually allow us to help meet our goals and reduce dependence on natural gas. And then, of course, some more flexible policies that allow us for extended day ahead of market, which basically means that allow us for a better match of supply and demand by coordinating the bids that the different providers make a day ahead to the actual needs that come from the demand. And then ultimately, one of the things that we often don't like to talk about is really real-time demand-side management policies that would actually push electricity consumption to hours where renewables are mostly active. So imagine with smart technologies, perhaps one of the things that we could do is to program, if in the future, the hours where we use a lot of our appliances at home to match the supply a little bit better. So I want to conclude just by giving you a snapshot of where we are in 2024 and what should come next. It seems to me that what should come next is to continue to rethink the role of rooftop solar, and perhaps instead of being trapped in the political discussion of the incentives to sell back to the grid, I actually think that all the discussion should now move towards more incentives for batteries. And this is because batteries can actually help energy to the grid when it's most needed. And this could actually be absolutely crucial to provide power during potential blackouts. The other trend that we are seeing, which I actually think it's quite desirable, is to go big on offshore wind. And here, AB 525 is the law that is really pushing us in this direction. And so the goal would be to generate enough offshore wind to power roughly 25 million homes by 2045. One of the related points that Governor Newsom has highlighted is the idea of phasing out oil and gas pre-existing subsidies and to a certain extent make polluters pay. And to conclude, I could not stop but stressing that ultimately this is a broader infrastructure problem, and we need to think very careful about the aging of our transmission hires, and how could we adopt grid enhancing technologies to actually help maximize the capacity of existing power lines. So I think I gave you plenty of information. I would stop here. I think I actually already run out of time. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Antonio. Very, very helpful indeed. And Eddie is next. We'll follow you, and then, of course, please put your questions into the Q&A portion. We'll be more than happy to ask our experts. Eddie?
All right. Hey, thank you very, very much for setting it up, Dr. Bento. I'm Dr. Eddie Jordan with SitelogIQ. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. And today we've been asked to talk a little bit about energy project financing. So on the agenda for this presentation today, a little bit of an introduction and a disclaimer, make sure we're following the rules here. Talk about utility costs and maybe a little bit more about what Dr. Bento was talking about. Why implement those energy projects? How those projects, energy projects, compare to general construction, how you can utilize one to do the other. How does financing an energy project work? And what are some of the barriers that you have for those different options? Quick shameless plug, SitelogIQ is a nationally accredited energy services company. We deliver energy, water, renewable, and infrastructure programs to state and local governments and California special districts. But we are not a municipal finance advisor. I want to make sure that's clear. The following contents for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, tax, financial, or other advice. And it's of a general nature and does not address any circumstances to a particular individual or entity. All right, now that we got that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about what Dr. Bento was mentioning and how we have a reliability issue here in California and utility costs are rising due to it. This is an example of utility rates in Northern California. I'm going back to that 1978 PURPA decision when policy really started taking effect. Rates have gone up rapidly, especially in the last 2 to 3 years. And that's really going to affect how we move forward with these programs. We spent most of the morning talking about EV and the EV mandates, clean fleet requirements, but we haven't talked too much about the volatility of the grid and how the grid is impacted by wildfires, storm damage. And we're going to need more renewable energy, not only due to mandates, but also to help provide electricity needed for these new mandates. So why do energy projects? There's several reasons why you might do energy projects. Like we're talking about today for most of the day is the state mandates and compliance requirements and federal requirements. These requirements are putting a lot of the cost and pressure on a lot of your different districts here to implement different new renewable energy programs, new clean fleet vehicle programs. And on top of that, new requirements to do the solar rooftops. Every new construction is going to require solar, new construction is going to require EV charging, and hopefully with the proper incentives, new battery energy storage. But we have a real resiliency problem. We have a lot of PSPS events, outages, and other issues. The main reason most people do energy projects, though, is for cost savings. Well, you may not save costs right away. It's cost savings over the life of the program and your ability to hedge future energy costs. What type of energy projects can you be doing to help do this? We kind of like to bucket energy projects into 3 different buckets. There's conservation, generation, and management. On the generation or on the conservation side, these are really projects that you're doing to bring your energy usage to as low as possible. We kind of call this the low-hanging fruit. Lighting, controls, I mean, everybody should have LED lighting by now, we hope, but we're still finding facilities that still have old T8s and T12s, actually on some. Replacing your HVAC. Now we're being required here to upgrade the HVAC away from gas, natural gas, and fuel and propane. So electrification of your HVAC system. A lot of facilities do not have the capacity to do that, especially in these rural communities that don't necessarily have air conditioning already. Adding more insulation to your property, new construction, better windows, etc. And I circled EV chargers and vehicles because that's what we talked about most of the morning here. Yes, EV charging is a conservation type measure because you are saving on your diesel and your natural gas or whatever fuel you're using, propane. But you're now taking that fuel and moving that to your on-site EV or your electrical requirements. Of course, for generation resilience, you have your solar, wind, geothermal, microgrids. We think microgrids are going to have to be a lot more important in the future here, especially with the aging infrastructure we have and the requirements that many of you have to keep the electricity operating on those outage events. And that includes battery storage and even cogeneration. Now, I agree a little bit. I think natural gas is going to have to stay around for a little while until we can really get the battery storage implemented. But all this stuff needs to be managed. So you can actually save quite a bit of money by doing some sort of demand management programs, much like Dr. Bento was talking about, utilizing energy storage and thermal energy storage to take advantage of peak periods of generation and utilizing them in off-peak. Retro commissioning, you make sure you continue to maintain these systems and make sure they're operating correctly. You don't want your systems operating when they shouldn't be. What's nice about energy projects and the savings that they can provide for you, you can also utilize those savings to tack on more projects, anything from blacktop to rooftop. You can include new construction. You can do projects that address more comfort, convenience, less so on the energy side. Look at some operational and deferred cost savings, especially if you've done your master plans lately. You see some major cost items that you have in the next 10 years in order to modernize your facilities. And we can address other immediate needs and wants with those projects. So how does energy financing work? It's a pretty simple diagram here to kind of explain how it works. You have your current utility payments and operating costs. You take those current operating costs and you figure out what those are going to be for the next 20 to 25 years. You go ahead and develop a program to help offset those costs over the next 20, 25 years, and you utilize some sort of debt service or a power purchase agreement or other lease payment to help finance that. And so what you see here in that second column, you're hopefully going to reduce your utility costs, your cost to PG&E, SCE, or whoever it may be. Then you have your debt payment or lease PPA lease payment, and hopefully what you should, in order for it to be a legit energy project, is have some cash savings at the top. Now, for those of you that decide to purchase your equipment instead of leasing it through a PPA, you can actually take advantage of some of those cash savings towards the tail end of that project, or utilize those savings or bank them for any type of other modernizations you need in the future. What's nice is all those cash savings can go back into the general fund for those future programs. This is a pretty busy slide. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time going through each one in detail. And these are just some of the examples of some financing that we've been looking at over the last 40 years we've been in business. And I believe Rebecca is going to talk a little bit about another program, so I don't have it included on here. So most of you are familiar with traditional bond financing, ones you have to go get public approval for, going out to the during the election cycle. Could be a revenue bond, tax secured bond, something of that nature. It's pretty much market interest rates and whatever you can do when you sell that bond. Terms are 45 to 40 years. We generally see project sizes being greater than 10 million in size because it is a fairly complicated and long process. 24 plus weeks to get it. I mean, you're not going to choose in October that you're going to put a bond in November. So there's a lot of upfront work, including hiring your municipal finance advisor or whatever financial partner that you use. And closing costs are quite expensive, or at least costs to get the bond are quite expensive because of the time that it takes. What we see most of the time, and the vast majority of the projects these days, are actually tax-exempt lease purchases. There's different names for them. I see TLMMs, there's different names, but essentially it's an equipment secured lease and or purchase. Their market rates are maybe just above market rates. Generally, terms can last up to 25 years, but these days, because of the higher interest rates, we're seeing them 20 years being the max. 1 million plus some project sizes. Now you do every once in a while see ones that are lower than that, but there's very few banks that are willing to lend lower than that $1 million mark. But they're super fast close. We're talking 6+ weeks, not a whole lot more difficult than a mortgage for your home. And closing costs are between 1% and 2% generally. Very similar to that type of loan is a COP. Generally, it's a real property lease or it's secured by your property that you may own. It's also at market rates and maybe a little bit less than an equipment leased or TLP. Very similar terms. Project sizes, we recommend, larger projects, you do the COP approach because you can generally get a better rate, but 5+ million. It is a more complicated, takes a little bit longer to close, and has a little bit more closing costs. Of course, talked a lot about grants and grant opportunities, but grants are competitive, and quite frankly, your odds of getting one are pretty limited. You have to be in a special circumstance to generally win those grants. So we do not recommend you depend on grants for your programs, but it's always nice to go get them. We also recommend you go find a partner that can go get those grants for you. They do take a while to get, and they have quite a bit of cost associated with them because your hit ratios are 1 in 5 or so, and every grant you go after, it's going to cost you a lot of money investment. Subsidized loans, this is getting more and more popular. There are some barriers to it. These are loans such as like the CEC, ECA loan, the DOE loan guarantee programs, USDA loan guarantee programs, etc. iBank is another local one here in California. I've seen them secured by real property or as simple promissory notes. It just depends on the provider. Generally, these are below market. They don't require too much collateral necessarily. Terms are 10 to 30 years, but they do take a long time. We actually had one that took over a year to close because they're very complicated process to go through. And the closing costs and fees are quite a bit longer. Now, if you decide that you don't want to own it, you decide that you want to change out your energy provider for somebody new, or maybe have somebody new take over most of those costs, you do have power purchase agreements and energy as a service agreements. What you're essentially doing is you're taking your utility now and working with another energy service provider for a certain term to provide that energy later. Now, power purchase agreements are specific to kilowatt hours, electricity. They're above market. And the reason I say above market, because this is private financing. You're going out to the private markets and they want pretty high rates of return. But at the same time, you can keep it off balance sheet, right? You're just taking one energy cost and shifting it to another. Terms can be 5 to 30 years. Project sizes we're generally seeing are 2+ million. They're pretty fast closes. There's lots of companies out there that know what they're doing with these programs. Energy as a service is very similar, but you can include other things like therms and lumens. So you can get lighting retrofits done. You can do central plant replacements, HVAC, et cetera, and you're essentially paying for the availability of those therms and lumens. So those are some of the examples of different financing. I know Rebecca's going to talk about a couple others later, but there's a lot of projects or barriers for these energy projects. And as you can see, almost 1 in 3 energy projects, and this is based off a study that was done a few years back, almost 1 in 3 do not move forward because of a lack of funding. So funding is one of the largest barriers to these energy projects. So we recommend you get with that financial advisor, that financial partner early. Figure out what you can or can't do, what you can afford, what your rating is, et cetera. And that way it'll help better guide you to what program works best. There's always that uncertainty in the savings of that energy project. Is it really going to save enough to cover the cost? Are we going to get that payback? So we have some recommendations to get over these barriers. And really, it's like I said before, team with the right set of experts. Find that right ESCO partner, that right company, somebody that you can trust that has that technical expertise to take that project for you, to develop that project for you. And then find that financial partner advisor and make sure the two work together well. And that's how you can make sure a project is more successful. And then we do recommend utilizing the design build approach. It's shown to be faster, cheaper, better. You work with one entity to kind of develop it from cradle to grave. And what's nice, to offset some of those concerns from the previous slide, a lot of times those companies will guarantee the cost of the project, they'll guarantee the savings, and they'll guarantee the workmanship. And so it makes it a lot easier for you to get these projects and have them become more successful. With that being said, if you have any more questions about SitelogIQ or some of the slides we had on there, this is the team in California. Feel free to reach out to them anytime. And thank you. Thank you, CSDA, USC, SCE, and SDLP.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Really appreciate it. And next is Rebecca.
Thank you for having me today. I will be going over third-party energy efficiency programs and on-bill financing. So investor-owned utilities such as Southern California Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric, San Diego Gas and Electric, and Southern California Gas, they contract with third-party companies such as CLEAResult, my company, to design and implement energy efficiency programs to help business customers save energy. These programs are funded by the California Public Purchase Program Fund, which is a state-mandated program that includes energy efficiency, renewable energy, and low-income customer assistance. So all customers are paying into these programs on their utility bills. So participating in them is really taking advantage of the dollars you have already put into it. CLEAResult provides programs throughout California in the public sector and for special districts. Our programs act as a one-stop shop for public sector customers, offering technical assistance, assessments, resources, and incentives. We built these programs to be comprehensive based on what the customer's energy goals are and to support those carbon reduction goals. So here's an example of different incentive pathways. There's the traditional approach with deemed and custom measures. Deemed typically being those set incentive amounts with smaller projects and shorter timelines, and then custom, as well as the metered or NMEC pathways, typically larger projects, longer timelines, and review process. Then we have the strategic energy management offering. This is the holistic whole facility approach that focuses on low cost, no cost, and behavioral measures. Your organization works with an energy coach offering, and they offer technical services to help you identify projects. We then will track and model the facility's energy usage and provide incentives based on the savings shown in that model. So our SCM customers see an average savings of 3% of their annual energy use, which translates to significant savings in overhead cost. Along with incentives based on energy savings, each participant also receives up to $10,000 in milestone incentives just for completing certain steps in the program. Each organization is paired with an engineer and a coach to kind of walk and assist you through this whole process. We also offer workshops in a cohort form, so you can collaborate with other like organizations. And it's also, just really good for perception with your community, employees, and students, or those folks in your network. So you can reach out to me if you have any questions about these programs or would like to find an eligible program for your organization. So on-bill financing, this is a loan program offered through the investor-owned utilities, and it's designed to facilitate the purchase and installation of energy efficiency measures. OBF works alongside the energy efficiency programs, and typically the third-party company can assist you with the OBF application and through the process. OBF loans offer no interest financing with no fees or loan costs. The loan is conveniently paid through your monthly utility bill based on your project's energy savings. Loan term limits are typically up to 10 years and between $5,000 and $250,000. And there are some cases where the utility can make an exception for a higher loan amount. So here's a list of energy efficiency websites within each IOU. Here is also a simplified project loan example. For instance, if a project is $100,000 and the incentive is $25,000, then the loan amount would be for $75,000. And if the estimated monthly savings on that project is $3,000 per month, then that loan would have a payback period of 25 months or 2 years and 1 month. OBF programs may vary between different IOUs, so please speak with your utility directly. I'm also able to answer any questions or point you in the right direction as well for these. So that is my presentation. Thank you very much for all of your time, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I really appreciate it. I don't see any questions in here. And thank you for keeping us on time. In fact, we have a few minutes. If there's any questions, I'm happy to ask. But while I do that, I want to thank, of course, my dear friend and colleague, Antonio Bento. Dr. Bento has been a tremendous supporter of our research and especially our work into the environmental domain and California's advancement, as he spoke about. And of course, the practice, because his way of approaching the issue is, of course, extremely helpful to those of us in the practice and leading communities and trying to adhere to some of these mandates and responsibilities. Some are realistic, some are not. And we just need to constantly adjust ourselves to make sure that we all want what we want. And there's no question about climate change. There's no question about wanting reduction of emissions. There's no question about preserving our planet. There's no question about any of these things. The question becomes how to do it ultimately, and the challenge of doing it, which I think my dear friend Antonio addressed. And Antonio, what is the next phase of this research actually? Where are we going? If you can give us a glimpse of perhaps what you're working on, and EU as well, as because the EU has been at the forefront, especially in trying to manage all of these different opportunities.
Right. So this is a very good question. And in the European Union, there's obviously been a very fierce debate between the countries like those in Southern Europe, Portugal and Spain, that of course have gone much faster on renewables and perhaps actually prematurely phased out coal. And now what we are seeing in those countries is, with the spike in the price of natural gas that I was referring to, indeed the price of wholesale electricity went to the roof, requiring a series of interventions to assure that ultimately these effects wouldn't pass all the way to consumers in the form of higher retail prices. And so what I try to highlight, and of course I understand that this is more a panel on finance, which is obviously a topic that I don't work on, is that we need to, as you said, be very careful on how we look at these policies. Policies are often meant to be designed to be ambitious. They don't have to necessarily be met, and that this is why we make them evolve, right? So policies are designed based on the state of the art of technology, but in this case is more than that, because one of the things that we have to recognize is that there is this aspect of volatility that I try to highlight, both in terms of the amount of renewables that would be available at every single hour in every single day. So for example, yesterday was beautifully and sunny here in California. Today is sprinkling, right? So you can see immediately what that does to the amount of renewables that would be available at a certain hour. But then on the other hand, is also this idea that the pressure really now is in moving as fast as possible with batteries, because if indeed, as policymakers, the decision is to move more towards renewables, then until you solve the storage problem, you're really putting your system very vulnerable in terms of availability of energy, dependence on natural gas, and resulting price. And so it's interesting that you ask your question, because many years ago, I think in part influenced by the environmental lobby, I was not all that sympathetic to nuclear energy, for example. But what we are learning, and actually I think France is a very good example, is that even though Of course, after you've made your investment in a renewable project, the price, the operating cost of renewables are much lower than nuclear. Nuclear, to a certain extent, gives you a continuous level of energy that removes part of the vulnerability that we are seeing with renewables. And so I think this also has lessons for California, which is perhaps we need to think a little bit the balance between wind and solar. I know that now we are moving very quickly into this offshore wind, and that's great. But again, my figures show that even with that scaling up, there's going to be many hours during the peak hours where, until you solve the bottleneck of storage, which I don't think we're going to solve it very quickly, we're gonna have to have other sources of energy. And so if natural gas puts us at farther vulnerability, this begs the question, what should be, for example, the role of nuclear? That's on the supply side. On the demand side, I think it's also tricky because we see, of course, movements towards attempting to push consumers to move their demand across the hours of the day. But the reality is that, you know, for those of you that drive electric vehicles, if you don't charge them at work, the time you're going to charge them is at home at night, right? It's not that we still are not in a world where our cars are driveless to the point that they take us to work and we tell the car, now go back home and get charged at a time where nobody is using the grid and then come back and pick me up. That's kind of an illusion, right? And so I think there is also a technological bottleneck here, which is perhaps there are appliances at our homes that can be made smarter and smarter to almost operate without us being there. So as long as they are programmed, and that would indeed move the demand to these hours that are more powered by renewables. But ultimately, it's really going to be storage that is going to solve this problem, right? And so I appreciate the push by the state to really ramp up on storage, but you know, the bottleneck there is still storage capacity on a per house basis, and then of course the upfront costs of storage technologies.
Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for giving us a glimpse of what we also expect in policy. And I want to thank the entire panel members as we start our next panel.